We'll go ahead and call to order the Thursday, June 24th, 2021 meeting of the Clive City Council. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mayor Sarcina?
Here.
Councilmember Klein?
Here.
Edwards? Here. McCoy?
Here.
Judkins?
Here.
And no Weaver.
No Ted this evening. Okay, nice to have everybody else. Nice to have all of you with us. Please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. The next item is approval of the agenda. I'm not aware of any changes. Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Agenda is approved. Okay, our next item, this is a time where anyone in the chambers can address the council on an item that is not on the agenda this evening. Is there anybody here to do so? Seeing none, we'll move to consent items.
Move the resolution. Second.
Moved by John, seconded by Eric. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? And that passes 4-0. Thank you. All right. Now we have a presentation, and Jeff is going to guide us through that. Jeff, come on up.
Mayor, Council, it's my pleasure tonight to be here, introduce the newest member of our team. As you know, hiring's a little difficult right now, and we feel very fortunate to have found someone qualified and someone to add to our team. Ryan comes to us. He's spent some time taking care of Finkbine Golf Course. He has some grounds maintenance and some machinery operation skills, and we're glad to have him aboard. And with that, I want to introduce Ryan. See if you have any questions.
Ryan, welcome. Glad to have you on the team. And
thank you.
Anything you want to share with us, we'd be glad to.
I'm just glad to be here. I'm looking forward to getting everything going and being part of the team, so I appreciate it.
Outstanding. Council, anything for Ryan?
Welcome. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Nice to have you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Jeff, thank you. Okay, our action item this evening is a public hearing regarding the Meredith Drive Warrior Lane HMA overlay project. And Matthew, did we post appropriate public notice?
Yes, Your Honor, we did. It was June 9th, I believe. I don't have it written down here with me. I will find that, and I will update you in a moment.
We'll go with that for now. Jim?
Thank you, Mayor. The city received bids last week for an asphalt overlay project to be completed yet this year on sections of Meredith Drive and Warrior Lane. This project will be in conjunction with the cities of Urbandale and Waukee. Does the dot cam work, Matthew? Can't? Don't wanna. So this project map is an exhibit that was included in the 2080 agreement in conjunction with the project that was approved on consent and shows the rough project limits. We are west of Alice's Road and north of Hickman Road. Based on those corporate limits, Clive's portion of the project is approximately 40% of the total cost. 3 bids were received. You have a tabulation of that in your packet. As you notice, all 3 were clustered right around $1 million, and there was a pretty big discrepancy between that and the opinion of probable construction cost. Based on that discrepancy, obviously we like to be a little closer on those, but we did reach out to the low bidder and the Asphalt Paving Association of Iowa to try to understand that a little better. A few of those reasons were included in the memo. I'll touch on a couple of those with you here tonight. The main reason was just the kind of the urban versus rural setting. All the projects we've done in the past have been in residential areas where you have to match curb and gutter and driveways and make sure you have positive drainage at intersections, so your production is hampered a little bit. Essentially out here, this far out west, we're basically overlaying a county road and their production can really ramp up. So I think that was one of the main reasons for the discrepancy. The other is there are now 3 bidders in the metro area. We've always been lucky to get 2 bids on asphalt projects. In the past 4 or 5 years, Inroads Construction has become a player in the market as well. And in talking with the low bidder, you know, that factors into how they put their bids together. More competition is better for us. Clive is the lead agency on the project, and we would recommend award to Des Moines Asphalt. Waukee considered the bids at their meeting this past Monday, and Urbandale is expected to consider and concur with our award at their meeting next Tuesday. Be happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Jim, council? Eric?
Jim, feedback from Joaquin Urbandale, all positive, going with our recommendation of low bidder.
Yes.
Other questions for Jim?
Move to close public hearing.
Second.
I will state for the record, it was published in the Des Moines Register on June 9th.
Very good, thanks, Matthew. It's moved by Eric, seconded by Susan to close the public hearing. Before we do, is there anybody here to speak on this item? Seeing none, will the council please vote? Passes 4-0.
Move the resolution approving plans and specifications.
Second.
Moved by Eric, seconded by Susan. Any discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? Passes 4-0.
Move the receipt of bids.
Second.
Moved by Eric, seconded by Susan. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? That passes 4-0.
And move the resolution awarding the contract to Des Moines Asphalt and Paving for $972,880.50.
Second.
Moved by Eric, seconded by Susan. Further discussion? Seeing none, will the council please vote? And that passes 4-0. Jim, thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to getting that done. Okay, discussion items. The first one is regarding the Northwest Development Area Traffic Engineering Study. Jeff? Matt?
Lead off, okay. Oh, no, that's fine. No, glad to be here. It's been a little over a year ago, I guess, almost 2 years ago, that we approved this project. It was a study to look at our Northwest Development Area in conjunction with both Waukee and Urbandale. They spent some time doing the study. We got, I think, a lot of our traffic studies in right before COVID, thankfully, so the data was good that way. We finished up the report, and we've been working with the communities to try to reach an agreement, a memorandum of understanding on how we proceed. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but right now I'm going to introduce Andy Swisher to present to you the findings of that report.
Eddie, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for giving me a little bit of time. And I guess I should start off with a quick apology for making your council packet so thick. But with that in mind, I did take that 200-page report and condense it down to 12 quick slides. So we should be able to move through this fairly quickly. How do we get this one?
We need to share the screen on that?
Yep.
Is that?
Did it go to sleep?
There we go.
Then you can just advance with your arrows or with
Okay.
the mouse.
Okay, perfect. So again, we are here to discuss the Northwest Development Area Traffic Study. Let's go to slideshow here. There we go. So as you guys are probably aware, this is the northwest area of Clive. Heavily, influenced as well by your neighbors, Waukee and Urbandale. So the study was really taking a look at a few core street corridors as well as 4 primary intersections, and trying to come up with a plan for what would be the needs for those corridors and those intersections in the future. The study collected data, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. We reviewed community development plans from all 3 municipalities, and then made roadway cross-section recommendations based on some analysis that we did. But really, the purpose of the study was to provide consistency in the roadway cross-section and the amenities in the roadway across all 3 jurisdictions, and then be able to provide some level of timing of when those needs we're going to need to incur. So this is just kind of a bit zoomed in. You can see we focused the study area on Meredith Drive, Warrior Lane, and Alice's Road, with the intersections there of Meredith Drive, Warrior Lane, Meredith Drive, and Alice's Road, Berkshire Parkway, and Douglas Parkway. Again, part of the study tasks that we went through, we did collect some traffic count data, as Jeff alluded to. We were able to get that done in February of 2020, prior to all the COVID pandemic shutdowns. So we felt like we had a good data collection set to work with, and so that was kind of the basis for a lot of the traffic forecasting that we did from there. But we completed traffic forecasts, completed some operations analysis to go along with that. We did review crash history in the area. And I don't have any other slides detailing that. Really, we wanted to take a look at that to figure out if there was anything that was coming out of that crash history that might influence a need or influence geometry of a roadway or something. But really, the level of data that was out there in that area, there wasn't a lot of crashes to draw any real hard conclusions from. So. And then finally, we went through what we call the corridor visioning, where we took the results of our analysis and started to lay that out into the needs of the corridors over time. Collected traffic count data in February of 2020. This is the snapshot of what we collected. As you can see, volumes ranged on a daily basis. The highest volume was kind of that south end of the study area there along Alice's Road with just over 10,000 cars a day, and then the volumes kind of were less than that, depending on where you were at throughout the rest of the corridors. As I mentioned, we did an exercise where we forecasted traffic out to 2050. As part of that, we did obtain information from the Des Moines Area MPO's travel demand model, where we looked at the growth scenarios that they had in their travel demand model for this area. We also collected their socioeconomic data that kind of is behind the scenes driving their travel demand model, so we could do a bit of an evaluation of that as well. And we shared that information back out with all 3 communities, just to do a cross-check. Does everybody agree with what's in there and what's really driving the growth that the MPO's model is showing? And we did have a little bit of input back from, I believe it was Waukee that provided a little bit more input back. So we did make a few tweaks to what we got from the Des Moines MPO for the purposes of this study, trying to get to something that was a little bit more of a full build out of the area. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Does that information then go back to MPO as a suggestion so they can look at it and decide if they want to correct theirs?
It could. It very well could. As the MPO does their every 5 years, they have to do an update of their long-range transportation plan, and the communities all have to provide that input every 5 years. And so as your development changes, if things are speeding up or slowing down, then you would provide that information at that time. That would probably be the likely scenario when that would occur. And I can't remember off the top of my head where the MPO is at in their cycle of when they're doing their updates. So.
Ed's not here to reaffirm that for you.
So I'm showing here the 2050 forecast, which was the furthest year out that we did a forecast for. But again, we had data from 2020, so we did 10-year incremental forecasts. So we had 2030, 2040, and 2050 that we could look at to come up with the needs of the corridors. This slide just shows a very high-level summary of the results, really, of our analysis, where we were able to look through, just like I said, look at 2030, 2040, 2050. We primarily kind of focused on those intersections and the operations of those intersections. And again, traffic engineers, we love to speak in terms of level of service, where you've got an A through F scale. And so in a metro area like this, we want to see everything at a level of service D or better. And so as we went through the analysis, those areas that we were getting poor levels of service, then we needed to add capacity in 2030 or 2040, whatever year it might be, to get to that acceptable D or better level of service. So these couple of pictures here are in the report and just kind of a summary of what we came up with. But basically boils down to a need for a 3-lane cross section in certain areas, by 2030, and then going to a 5-lane in certain areas by 2040 or 2050, depending on the volumes and the nature of the roadways. In addition to that, we did a high-level multimodal review of the area where we looked at the plans from all three communities for the trail networks and various multimodal aspects. One of the things that did come out was the city of Urbandale does have a complete streets policy now that they're following. And so, part of that was, looking at the amenities that they're providing as part of their now policy document. And really what we were looking for is just continuity between facilities as you go through the three communities. And so with that, with the results of our analysis, with the results of this high-level multimodal review, then we came up with these proposed cross-sections for future improvements. So top left there, we've got a 5-lane with a median, which, as you came to intersections, you could obviously take that median and add a left turn lane in those locations. Bottom, we've got a 3-lane cross-section. You will notice there is a trail and sidewalk, a trail on one side, sidewalk on the other to facilitate that multimodal aspect. And then the top right was sort of a proposed interim cross-section. So if you had an area where, let's say, a 3-lane was needed in 2030, but it was going to need to be improved to a 5-lane within, 10 years or 15 years, what have you. We've got a cross-section out there that's sort of an interim level 3-lane section that can be widened out to 5 lanes in the future fairly easily. And with that, I would open it up to any further questions. And I know city staff has some additional discussion.
So before we get into that on the staff side, if there's questions for Andy in terms of the analysis.
Questions, council?
Yes, and beforehand, remember, if you would, please try and speak into the microphone so we get good audio quality for people participating remotely.
Got it. Questions for Eddie, council?
Gonna make it easy on me tonight.
Exciting. It's coming fast. So Jeff, I guess walk us through as we, and particularly with Alice's Road, walk us through what we can expect there from a timeline perspective.
Be glad to. Back up just a little bit. This report took quite a while to finish up, and as Andy alluded to, we did send some data out and requests to both Waukee and Urbandale to get some input on it and some information. The final result, we've kind of come to an agreement with Waukee as far as what we're going to do with Warrior Lane. The asphalt project that you just approved, we're planning on getting somewhere in the 12 to 15 years out of. We're in agreement that will service that area until that time, and that at the end of that time, we will go together and do a project to probably make that a 3-lane concrete street at that time, somewhere in that 12 to 15 year range, which is supported by the study and which is what was recommended. Meredith's a little different story. We have some disagreement up there. The study shows that the 3-lane would be adequate up there for somewhere around 2040, 2050. In talking with Urbandale, they're not quite in agreement with the input or the projections included in the report that we asked them to provide, that they did not provide anything additional. They would like to do a 5-lane road in 2023. I told them that's probably not possible on our end and not something we're interested in at this time. If you look at our long-range plan and you look at our CIP, we're pretty full up through 2025. What you haven't seen in the CIP moving forward, the next 5 years as they come in, as we kind of project out, is Alice's Road, which what you asked about. We will start with the south portion south of Douglas and up through the Douglas intersection 25, 26. Probably work on up from Douglas through Berkshire in 26, 27, and then probably 28, 29 on up to Meredith to get that. Remember that Urbandale is currently working on the intersection of Meredith and Alice's, and that will be completed next year sometime, so we'll just be making the connection up to it at that time. Like I said, we propose that will take through 2030 as far as some of our big commitments in improving that, and then at some time down the road, we would look at what we would want to do on Meredith. Our position at this time and following the report would be that a 5-lane wouldn't be awarded until sometime in 2020 late 2040s, around 2050. So as far as an agreement with Urbandale, we have not reached one. The one thing we did come to agreement on is that they'd asked that as far as their multimodal, they'd like to run a 10-foot trail down to the Greenbelt. Typically, our on-street right-of-way type trails are 8 foot, but I think if they're going to run 10 down to that, we can probably put the extra 2 foot on down to the trail and continue that on. So as far as moving forward, we're going to move forward with an agreement and a memorandum of understanding with Waukee. And what we have with Urbandale at this time, we'll just have to work together as we move forward.
Yeah, let's just keep working with them. You know, I think their development expectation is just different than
Yeah.
what our reality is. So, you know, obviously.
And I would add to that, Your Honor, too, I think the financial expectations that we have as well, and knowing that the Alces Road reconstruction is going to be quite expensive for that time period, and that is going to tie up a lot of resources. And we've shared that with Urbandale, that just financially, I don't think we're going to have the capacity till after that Alces Road project at the earliest in the 2030s to be able to put resources towards a 5-lane road. Some things that we talked about with the asphalt project that was just approved is looking at some thicker asphalt than we would normally do to, again, try to get some additional years of life out of that asphalt. And then when we go to urbanize Meredith, you know, then we can have the discussion of, depending on where pricing is at and where the financial capacities are of the two cities at the time and what we're comfortable with, okay, maybe then we look at 5-lane or 3-lane, 5-lane discussion, and we come to an agreement on it. But there was no, I don't think there was any way we were going to be interested in doing that in 2023, and we made that very clear that that was way too soon. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to us to 5-lane Meredith when we haven't even done that to Alces Road yet. So Alces Road is the priority, as you saw on the traffic demand modeling. It is where the traffic is at and now and in the future, and that's where our focus is on the resources. And so what you'll see, really starting to work with the city of Waukee, and we've already queued up a number of, and Waukee actually submitted one on our behalf this last time in the MPO cycle, of getting MPO SDP dollars for the segments of Alces Road as we work our way north. And then at some point here over the next few years, we'll start to get kind of design contracts together to start working on what the, how we interpret these cross sections that you see here into that roadway and working together, because this is also going to be a signature roadway for the western part of our community. And so what does that streetscape look like? What does that median look like? Waukee's done some things with their median and the design and the look of Alces Road to the south. And so is that something we want to talk about, how we continue forward to the north and making sure we're intentional and integrated with that, and also thinking through stormwater management and a whole lot of things that will go along with this, as well as that crossing where Little Walnut Creek currently goes underneath Alces Road and box culverts today, and whether or not those are still going to be large enough. Our hope is, or our fear is do those need to be bridges at some point when the modeling is done for the drainage underneath that roadway. And so that's going to do a lot of things to cost and other considerations of that right of way. So there's just a lot to be planned with Alces Road, that we're using this as kind of a guidepost for us to get into those conversations.
Westgate ended up being a bridge, so downstream it's unfortunately likely that we'll be considering bridges there rather than the box culverts, unfortunately, but again, we'll look at that data. The other thing to remember as we move forward is all these is based on projections of development. Actual development takes place a little bit differently, and as we get into the 2030s, we'll see if the development has happened or it hasn't happened and reevaluate and take a look at that. But it would take some, I guess, unexpected development from our standpoint to say we need a 5-lane anytime sooner than the 2030s, 2040s at the earliest.
Jeff, did Urbandale give any foundation or empirical data or traffic studies to support that jump to a 5-lane, or is it all just expectation on development?
No. Their position is they would rather build it to start with and not come back and mess with it. There's ways you can help that development. You get the right of way up front. You get the grading done. Minimize the impact to the residents in the future. Unlike, say, the Meredith section where we had to go and acquire right of way and do that. But if we do it properly with development, and Doug's aware of this, and Doug will be working with it, and we'll be working with the developers to make sure that that's laid out properly and it won't be as big an impact in the future. But no, their position is that they don't want to mess around. They just want to do it and get it over with.
So they do not have a study that contradicts this?
Correct.
No.
Well, clearly the priority is Alice's Road.
Yep.
Yeah, the traffic levels, and the road's already starting to show it, you know.
Just as a reminder, we have a patching contract, this year's arterial project that will include some patching on Alice's Road, both south of Douglas and a little bit north. That will hopefully buy us some time and get us through until we can start that 2025, 2026 timeframe for Alice's Road. So, and
We're
then,
doing that in collaboration with Waukee too.
yes,
Just
yeah,
to-
on the south side there. It was added.
Sections.
We had from Douglas up to Berkshire included. They came to us and wanted to look at doing a little something just to smooth that up and buy a little bit of time to get us through to 2025. So we added in some of the worst spots on Alice's Road to our patching contract in conjunction with them and working together with them to make
One of our
those.
thoughts too is when as Alice's Road gets to Douglas, is then finishing off Douglas as well, and getting from the Shule Elementary over to Alice's Road and completing that 5-lane as well to kind of roll that into that intersection project, and kind of depending on where the development and the acquiring of the homes there, I think we only have one left on the south side there of Douglas to get done in terms of kind of completing that whole section there before we start working our way north.
Well, we can all remember, but I would remind us of 156th Street and what occurred there. And, it was very disruptive. They had to go back in after the fact. The road essentially fell apart. And so, everything was already built up around it. And they had, then they had to go in and redo the whole thing. So I don't want to see that happen to us with Alice's Road. Because it's starting to happen. So I know we'll be diligent.
Yes.
Watch it, and if we need to make adjustments, we'll make adjustments. But anyway, this is great information. Jeff, thank you. Other questions, council, for Jeff?
I just have a comment. Given that it's Urbandale, I remember a few years ago, there was a commercial real estate meeting where an Urbandale council member asked a panel, how can cities best help be prepared for future development? And the primary answer was, don't do what happened with Westtown Parkway in, having to go back in and redo the road later. They said, look to Mills Civic Parkway. That's the way to do it. And probably since that question came from Urbandale, they remember that and are
No doubt.
trying to prepare.
I'd love to say it's easy that way, but when you look at the cost of doing it now and the needs, and you put a pavement out there that's not needed for 20, 30 years, and you lose half the life of it before it's actually needed, it just doesn't make good sense from my standpoint or our standpoint to just put it out there until it's needed, so.
The ROI for Clive just isn't there.
No, I mean, if you're talking 5 years, oh yeah, we could probably, but when you're looking 20 years down the road, that's a long time to pre-build it in hopes of development occurring the way you're anticipating it to, so.
Yeah, definitely with you on Meredith. Just want to make sure that we're really watching Alice's Road.
One thing we did do in the contract just approved, and Matt alluded to it, was we put in a couple of extra inches of asphalt on it so we could get some extra life out of it. And, Urbandale agreed to that, but then also talked 2 years, 3 years down the road, let's tear it out. So it just, I think we got plenty of life out of what we're going to put down this fall, and it'll serve us well for many years.
This will be the last gravel road that will be now. We won't have any more gravel roads other than one little tiny stretch west of Alice's Road, the little cul-de-sac, if you will. But this will, I know for in the winter time, especially for our snowplow drivers, this will make moving snow on Meredith a lot easier.
We're thrilled.
The asphalt. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Matt, anything more from your
We'll
end on
just,
that?
you'll hear, we'll come back to this in the CIP discussions in the fall when we start talking about that Alice's Road phasing, because it's going to be a number of years to work through that, and continuing to seek outside funding like MPO, SDP funding for helping us finance that project. And as Jeff alluded to in our conversations with developers, particularly in the Shadow Creek area around Meredith and Warrior, we're in the midst of negotiating out kind of that upfront payment. If you recall, when we had the last conversation on Meredith and the assessment issue, we talked through, or at least got direction from the council of looking to try to get those dollars ahead of time for the grading and elements from the developers to have that cash to go into the reconstruction and not having to necessarily go back and do assessments after it's been developed. And so we continue down that path as a staff for these arterial roadways, and doing that and actually right as we speak related to Meredith and Warrior.
Very good, okay. All right, well done there. Let's move to our second discussion item, and that's the Water Resources Master Plan, and Pete's going to guide us through that.
Thank you, Your Honor. Tonight, we're excited to continue a conversation that's been ongoing now for a number of months. In your packet, you saw the deck that we'll be going through tonight with a set of 3 questions, but or 3 topic areas with some multiple questions with each topic. Before I start, though, I want to introduce our friends and partners from HDR. They've been doing a great job getting us to this point, and we look forward to working with them and to get ultimately a wonderful plan for the city that will be a wonderful guide for years to come. So first, to our left, this is Stephanie Fleckenstein. On the far side, there is Steph Thane Hoagie, and then Brian Backey as well.
Welcome.
So, yep. At this time, I'd like to invite Stephanie to come on up. We're going to get her computer set up for the presentation, and then I'll present the initial questions, and then Stephanie will take us through the rest of the deck.
Good. Okay.
You should be able to go ahead and share your screen now from the Zoom.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a quick summary of where we are right now in our process. We are at that recommendations, between the prioritization and recommendations phases of the project. Tonight, specifically, we're going to be talking a little bit about some prioritized capital projects, rate structure, and some cost-benefit analysis. When we get to July and into August, we'll be moving down that timeline and be bringing some other key policy questions for the council as well. So this is a summary of the questions that we'll be tackling tonight, and later on in the deck, we come back to slides with the questions broken out. But the 3 primary topics this evening are, first, the pairwise exercise that you went through, where we take a set of values that are associated with many different types of water resources projects, prioritize those values then so that we have a common framework for comparing different and sometimes very different types of projects, very diverse projects. It could be a detention basin versus a stream bank stabilization versus operating and maintenance costs. We know that unlike some of the other infrastructure and utility studies we've done with roads and sewer, where you're comparing apples and apples more frequently, and when we're talking water resources, we're talking apples, pears, name all your favorite fruits. We think that this process gives us a chance to come up with a framework for understanding the relative value of these projects compared to each other. We're looking for guidance from all of you tonight about whether you think that is the appropriate path or not. Next topic area is the structure of the stormwater utility rate. So tonight, we're not talking about necessarily how much money we need to get from the stormwater utility now and in the future. We're asking tonight for your direction on what is a fair way to organize this rate so that we treat different types of property in an appropriate way. And then related to that, is the council interested in using the rate and attendant tools as well to start incentivizing different types of behavior? Right now, we use a kind of an industry standard approach where we have an equivalent, an ERU that we calculate, and all residences, regardless of their size, how many square feet of impervious surface they have, they're all just charged 1 ERU. Is that the fair way to do it? Does it create the right incentives? Is the fact that we treat commercial property on a square foot of impervious surface basis when calculating their rate a fair way to treat commercial properties? Tonight, we're looking for some direction from all of you on your preferred path. We don't need to have the final, yes, so this is the right way, but to get some guidance among many different options will be very helpful this evening. And then finally, building on what Jeff and others have, and Andy presented about Alice's Road and the discussion that you just had. Alice's Road, along with a couple other spots in the watershed, are some of the few areas we still have where we can do a regionally significant flood mitigation type project. Because of the rate that we are developing the Walnut Creek watershed, because of ongoing climate chaos and weather unpredictability, we're running out of spaces where we can go and do something to scale that is going to have a beneficial effect for multiple downstream stakeholders. In this case, we were specifically looking at the Indian Hills Woods neighborhood as our sort of test case, because this is the neighborhood we know has a high flood risk, but we don't exactly have a game plan for how we might mitigate that risk beyond just giving good information to individual property owners and showing them potential strategies for their individual properties. We have an opportunity now with some of these projects we've identified to move the needle, to build resilience there in that neighborhood, and also build resilience in some other downstream areas as well. So tonight we'll take you through those projects, a couple that we looked at as well that maybe have a more localized benefit to a particular area, and one project that we considered that is proving not to necessarily have such a huge benefit. But I don't want to steal all of Stephanie's thunder on the presentation. Stephanie, why don't you come on up, and I'll step out of the way so you can take us through the presentation.
Yep, appreciate it. Thanks very much. So we are going to begin talking about the criteria that you guys have graciously provided back to me. Thank you very much for either the Excel format or the SurveyMonkey format. However you got it to me, I really appreciate your time pulling that together.
Questions?
Did I write them?
No, that's my fault, Councilman. We worked on them together, though. It's been a good process.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to be in that room.
Well, I appreciate that you did it anyhow. So the criteria that we began with, that you guys provided input for, these should all look pretty familiar to you, but here are the criteria and the definitions of the amenity-rich public space, of does it provide a public amenity. Flood resiliency we measured by the actual reduction, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Ecological enhancement was, does the project improve environmental quality or create habitat? Existing infrastructure, does it protect any of those assets, particularly along Walnut Creek? Erosion reduction, we focused that on stream bank erosion reduction, costs for both capital and operation and maintenance, and then we changed equitable access to just be public access. Instead, we did evaluate a couple of projects that were located on private property or did not have public access, and that was something that we wanted to include in the prioritization. And then finally, is there potential for partnering, whether through mitigation credits or other grant programs in that format. So we did this analysis as well with some city staff members, and these are the results and outcome here. So this box and whisker plot will show us a few areas where there was a lot of consensus. Where those boxes are shorter, that means that all of the participants, their answers were pretty similar. Where the bands are longer, for example, amenity-rich areas, there was a little bit more of a diverse reaction to how important that criteria was and how we wanted to evaluate our projects based on that importance level. So when we talked through this, we did ask for feedback. Sharing everybody's answers together is, I think, helpful for us to both evaluate somebody else's or understand somebody else's perspective, but also maybe shift some of our answers as well. So I do want you to know that this is an ongoing process. We do want it to reflect what you feel and what is the appropriate way to address these projects. So we did that with city staff, and I wanted to point out a few things here. The highest priority there at the bottom of the screen came to be infrastructure risk and flood resiliency. Those stood out. There was strong consensus, and a few of those that we had varying opinions were for amenity-rich areas and stream bank erosion reduction. But more or less, you can see their results there. Here are the city council results, and which is really good feedback for us that maybe we need to revisit the definitions and clarify what exactly we are doing and how we are going to apply these to projects. The bands here are quite a bit bigger. You guys had some differing opinions on where these should fall in priority. Any strong reactions to that so far?
Ted Weaver couldn't be here tonight, but he said, go ahead and just float his to mine.
Okay. Okay, great. Just double count yours. Perfect. So these are the combined results with both city staff and city council answers here. So again, I want to point out flood resiliency and infrastructure risk, those really stood out with these combined lists. There are a few outliers, and you'll see those just as the singular dots. But when we did pull this information together statistically, that's kind of how it falls out that we did have that core, which is shown in the boxed area. Yes.
How many staff members to council members on the answering?
Sure. We had 6 staff members, and I believe we got all 6 as well. So what we did with this information as it stands right now is pull together that combined list that on the previous slide and pull together a rank. So here, starting from highest priority to lowest priority, as defined by your feedback, the highest importance level was for infrastructure risk, followed by flood resiliency, operations and maintenance cost, stream break erosion reduction, capital cost, pollutant removed, potential for partnership, amenity-rich areas, public use, and habitat created. I wanted to show you in both formats because I think it does kind of call a reaction if there's something that you disagree with or that doesn't sit quite right with you. Is anybody having a reaction like that? Does this list seem appropriate with the way that you answered your exercise?
I do remember being a little bit uncertain about what equitable access
Sure.
was. So it's interesting to see that change to public use.
That was after some feedback and the analysis that we did, that was a change that we made because the question we were really trying to get at was that private versus public. And so we wanted to use terminology there that was more consistent with the type of information we were hoping to get from all of you. Your point, though, Councilwoman, is good because this is our first sort of crack at this as a group together. And there's opportunity here for further refinement as we can improve our definition and also have ongoing discussion. These aren't set in stone at this point.
And I do remember really wondering what an amenity-rich area would be, having to interpret that a little bit. So, anyway.
Good feedback. Thank you. I will note both of those.
The trouble I had with it was, I understood it. It was, and you're looking at them, you're weighing them, and then you want to go back because you're thinking, if you did this, this comes with it, right? Or you would think logically it would come with it. So if you do flood resiliency, does stream break erosion reduction help with number 2, right? So if you get 4, 2 goes with it, but at what cost of O&M? Right? And is your ROI there? So
good point.
Those things are continually going to my head. So you saw a lot of mine were pretty neutral because it's, if I could have this, I'll get this. And if I get this, I'll reduce the infrastructure risk, right?
Sure.
If I can do stream break restoration. And so that's where mine were probably a little messy for you. But.
Well, when I went and put 3s across, and
the whole thing you did
what,
3s?
what that told me was that my number 1 priority was pollutant removed.
Yeah.
And that was not my number 1 priority. Pete and I had to talk about that a little bit, but as I look at the list here, I'm not surprised at it. I mean, I think it probably lays out pretty well, give or take 1 or 2 of these, maybe one's flipped, they're higher than another, but it's grouped pretty well together, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the simple folk like me, can you start putting in, like, could we see, even if it's July or August, could you, to Susan's point, could you label number 8 to some areas that you're kind of talking about? I understood why you didn't tell us, like, for example, this area, as an amenity rich. I understood why you didn't label. But now that we've gone through it, can you label them so we can put those areas with those? You said, I think definitions will matter.
Yes.
I had to keep going up to the definition and reading
Sure.
it again and again.
Sure. Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Pete.
Well, we're happy to do that. I think actually on these next couple of slides, you might start to see a little bit how this lands. Because if I understand your question right, Councilman, you're saying, what are the actual projects we're talking about and how do these actually now land on those projects?
Yeah, and to Susan's point, what is that amenity-rich area? Just as an example, that's multiple places.
I think, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, and also HDR partners, when we talked about that at the staff level, we were talking about things like parks and trails, but we were also thinking about opportunities for a private amenity, like a restaurant or a brewery, an outdoor seating area, a food truck area. We didn't want to limit it just to thinking about sort of the ways we think about city investments in our amenities now, which is overwhelmingly park, trail, and vegetation, opportunities for some education, getting in the water trails. We really wanted to open it up to leave space for what we might want to do in the future as well.
What I would offer from staff is we had a similar struggle in terms of how we each defined amenity-rich area and thinking about the green belt. And, you know, I defined it differently than Richard defined it. You know, we all had it from our different perspectives. And so as you saw on our slide, the amenity-rich one was the widest, it had the biggest extremes because we all had different definitions. So it's really been an iterative process for us working through this and thinking through how we would define it. And I think to the point that Pete brought up is kind of giving you some examples or some specific projects that maybe even help give us all a better context of these will be an important part of the next iteration that we will do with this kind of vision priority process, because this is going to be really critical to make sure that we're identifying what you all see as the priorities for the community as it relates to water resources.
I think it was important not to define it for us, though, on this first round, right? To allow us to define it ourselves, and now we're going to struggle.
Sure. And one of the things we also kept in mind as we were going through this process is, do we have the data available to us to be able to evaluate this? So for example, when you were asking about the stream bank erosion versus maybe pollutant removed versus flood resiliency, the way that we have looked, you know, down the road of how we will evaluate this, we really wanted flood resiliency to be flood stage reduction of, are we able to keep that peak lower? And for pollutant removed, we wanted that to be what's already captured, what is in the runoff, and what are we preventing from going downstream. And we really focused the stream bank erosion on what is actually protecting further erosion, or, you know, just that prevention to begin with at that point. So I understand the feedback of need some nuanced information with those definitions to go through, but I do appreciate your feedback. Thank you. So next, as we're talking about how these do apply to some of the projects, I want to talk about where we began. So we used 5 studies that have been completed previously, as well as some that were identified in our own analysis at this stage of the project. And you'll see those plans listed there. And there are many recommendations and many different ideas that have been presented in previous plans that we did want to cast that wide net to begin with, and go from there of really starting to work towards that prioritized, actionable CIP. So this is where we began, and we worked with staff to identify projects that may be obsolete or may have been completed or otherwise were double counted and show up in multiple plans. So the project list that we are going to be using in this prioritization process include nearly 100 projects with a total estimated construction cost of about $70 million. So those are broken out there by project type, just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what types of projects we're talking about, of what is included. There are some that are more ecologically driven, some that are primarily focused right inside the greenbelt, you know, within that floodplain, and others that are, you know, larger detention areas, as well as stormwater management adjacent to road reconstructions and park landings and different, a wide variety of projects you'll see listed there. And that's why it is so important that we are able to capture the multitude of benefits that we went through in that exercise to make sure that we're able to evaluate those on the same scale. I wanted to share this example process with you here for what the outcomes are going to look like. So each column here is a different project, and it will show you what those benefits are, what the scoring was after it goes through this process. So for example, I want to point out the orange boxes there of flood resiliency. There are 2 projects there that do a great job of actually providing that flood stage reduction that does not occur in other projects. And you're able to, if, for example, you are specifically interested in driving forward projects that don't have a high O&M cost, for example, you might be able to evaluate, okay, how are these lining up in the projects that we're presenting? So just wanted to give this example for you guys to look at this is what we're driving towards, to be able to line up these projects side by side and make sure that they're falling in line with our values. So my question to you is now, do you agree with this approach for comparing and prioritizing these diverse projects based on the values and rankings that you have provided? Yes?
I'll start off. I like to use metrics as far as data and metrics right there. And so, you know, to prioritize according to those metrics, I'm certainly in favor of that.
Great.
I definitely like incorporating that, but I liked seeing that list of projects and kind of how the priorities fit. And I thought, I really need to understand what buyout acquisition for 5 projects ends up costing $26 million. That one didn't make sense to me. So I thought, I'd be interested to learn more.
Much of that one is the flood-prone property buyout area, and we may have that all gathered up as one item, one line in the sheet, as opposed to each individual property that's in the flood-prone property buyout area.
So you could be talking Wittern Group, Atchison, everything.
It's
down.
everything that's in the boundary that we started off with.
Right.
It's in that flood prone. So the properties that are in that 100-year floodplain that were built in many cases before flood maps even existed. So it's that entire area. And I think when we started with that number was like close to 30 million
Yeah.
overall. And now with the first few phases, we've chipped away at that, mainly those residential
What's
properties.
our
But-
investment in that so far, Matt?
What's that?
What's our investment in the flood buyout so far?
Really, it's about $3 million.
About
$3 million.
About $3 million. And so, yeah, there's some significant industrial and commercial properties that get that number up there pretty quickly when you're talking about Wittern, and you've got Briggs across the street, Atchison. So you get to that 20 million number pretty quickly.
But that's a good call out. When we create the sheet, if it's useful, we can separate out those different types of properties that are in the flood-prone area, because obviously dealing with the purchase of a residential home is a very different animal than dealing with something as big as Briggs or Wittern.
It seems to me the process flushes out the values of the mayor and the council. And I think it reflects in the, you know, in the prioritization. Then we get specifics, and, you know, some of that can move around a little bit, but it seems to me to be working so far. Other thoughts, council, guidance on the question?
I like the strategy that you laid out. I'm not certain we're at the right answer on it.
Okay.
But I like what's laid out and using that as a tool, right, to drive us to those. Because when you showed the oranges, and if we would go back and see what those projects were, right, I think it was helpful not seeing the projects and it's orange. And so if you want orange, these are the 2 projects you pick, you know, with your biggest ROI. And so if you blindly look at that and say what we want, then you got to go back to the list and say, these are the 2, right? So I like that. I just think further definition and
Sure. Understood.
getting it down a little more detail, but
Right.
that's the right track for me anyways.
Great.
I think we're on the right track.
Great.
Weaver agrees.
Wonderful.
Realize he's going to watch this video, right? This video.
The next topic I wanted to share with you is about the utility rate structure options. So as we go through this process, we are creating a planning tool, which on this dashboard we'll be able to evaluate how aggressive we want to be with addressing some of these capital plans and how that is reflected both with debt service, customer growth rates, but be able to evaluate those variables on a temporal outline to be responsive to what those changes are of how quickly we anticipate addressing some of these projects. To create the different financial models for consideration, we're looking for your feedback right now about the structure for the utility rate. And Pete described this very well, that We know that there is a further conversation to be had about what that revenue growth needs to look like or how we want to structure that. But for the purposes of the conversation today, all of these scenarios are built to show the same amount of revenue incoming so that we can really just focus in on what does that structure look like to get us to that same number and make sure we agree there before we look at any future projections or what that system might look like. For the current stormwater rate structure, the methodology is to use the ERU approach. That is the industry standard for rate design. One ERU equals 3,667 square feet. So it's a single rate for all ERUs, which is what single-family residential properties pay, just that one ERU. And commercial customers pay a multiple of that based on their cover, their impervious cover, or what that property may look like. For example, a commercial customer with 10,000 square feet of impervious cover would pay 2.7 ERU. So as we were evaluating this, these are some of the inputs, as I was saying, that are going to hold steady based on the totals shown in the current CIP and what projects are being funded by the stormwater revenue. This again is constant variables here. So those are the expenses in the FY22 budget, and this will include a 10% rate increase for FY22. All of this information and everything that we are starting from is based off of cash flow information in PFN's documents, and we have not changed any of this information here. But what we are focused on are what are some of these alternatives. So the current rate structure is $9.47 per ERU, but there is another opportunity there to have a tiered system focusing on the residential rate. So a small residential versus a medium residential versus a large residential property could have a different fee that they are paying or a different rate. And we also evaluated a square footage structure, which would evaluate all of the impervious cover across the city, and then by parcel I want to talk about that base rate, and we have included that as to be reflective of some of the common spaces or the right-of-way or otherwise sidewalks, streets, things that do generate runoff, that do contribute to the stormwater system as all users contributing to that base rate, and then the square footage rate being reflective of what is on that property. When we talk about the square footage rate, that is the most representative of what we expect to be generated as far as stormwater off of that property. It's the most closely aligned with the water meter of the potable water that you would consume at your home. That's the best measure that we have of what do we expect for runoff, what is your stormwater contribution to the system. The final option there is for rebalanced rates, which was to address a concern of an imbalance of commercial properties having a little bit too much of a burden on them and residential not quite carrying their weight as far as the fee that they were being charged. So the structures there are tiered residential between the three, the base rate and square footage based on impervious cover, and then finally the rebalancing of residential increase. So this shows a couple of illustrations here of what those bills might look like. So if you look at the customer classes along the left there, you can compare them as you move to the right across the screen of what those changes might look like, and compare and pretend that if you were that customer receiving your bill, what your reaction might be to some of these different scenarios there. But they are the same of the current rate structure, the tiered residential, the base rate plus square footage, and we also included the square footage only, and then the rebalanced rates, which if you compare the current rate structure to the rebalanced rates, you'll see that shift from commercial over to the residential customers carrying a little bit more of that fee. Any questions?
There's a lot on this slide.
Stephanie, do you want to kind of, with the rebalanced rates?
Yes.
In terms of, and that rebalance is based on the number of ERUs versus the number of residential versus commercial. Do you want to kind of maybe further explain what happened in that rebalance? You know what I mean?
I don't quite follow.
So with the rebalance, when you have, because the residential is going up, so is it based on a percentage of how much residential ERUs versus commercial?
Yeah.
Kind of how that shifting happened?
We
Brian.
looked at all the impervious area in the city.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, so to rebalance, we looked at all the impervious area based on residential or commercial, and we found that based on the revenue that was being projected versus what the impervious area was, there was a little bit of an imbalance, and so to get everybody on the level playing field based on per square footage, these are the rates that we came up with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's an important point to note too, because if we didn't already have all of the calculations for every parcel in the city on the amount of impervious square feet, that would be a serious lift in front of us to be able to get to implementation of that type of model. But that information is already part of what the city has.
And that we update.
And that, update frequently.
Each one of these scenarios produces the same amount of revenue.
Yes, all these revenues are all the same.
So
but
it's
not
really
really.
apples to apples comparison of the utility with different rate structures.
Yeah, very.
But if it's all driving to the same level of revenue, really our question is equity.
That and also incentive. Because if
Well,
there.
dive into that if you would.
Sure. So, first, that fairness question, I think that's the big one that, in my mind anyway, as I'm logically working through this, comes first. Is it right that big house pays the same amount as small house, commercial is treated differently than all residential? That's interesting. The next one, though, is if we believe that the rate structure is an appropriate tool to use to drive certain types of behavior, where there is more, or where they potentially have less impermeable surface on their residential property or their commercial property, or do other practices that might help us catch water where it lands and not then stress the rest of the water resources network in the city, the storm sewer, and ultimately the creek and the drainages as well. Is there an advantage to the public when property owners do that, and therefore property owners should have some sort of advantage with a lower rate or a lower amount they pay, or some cost sharing potentially as well? That's what we mean by the different incentives that we could line up that might get different types of behaviors.
Okay, makes sense. Other thoughts, council, questions?
Are there any on this list that are not just non-starters? That would help us maybe whittle down the list. We don't need to get to the final answer this evening, it's a lot, but
In terms of which structure?
these types of, what types of preferences? Do you like the idea of treating tiering up the way the residential properties, for example, are presented an option with the tiered residential structure?
I'll start off. I think that's probably a little easier than going into individual with the square footage right there. Again, it's all about equity, and I think that our current system is probably outdated, and we need to find something a little bit more reflective of what's going on right now. I kind of like the tiered structure myself. If I had to lean towards one, that would be it.
And we want to keep it simple at the same time.
Exactly.
And, the tiered is pretty straightforward. Others?
I would agree. I'm especially uncomfortable looking at the rebalanced rates numbers and, keeping the current structure, just rebalancing a bit. I don't see that being very equitable.
That's helpful. Other thoughts?
I'll share, we were able to connect with Ted this morning on this presentation just to add to the discussion, because I know he's not here to participate, but he, similar to what Woman Jenkins and Councilmember Klein alluded to, is that he leaned a little bit more towards that tiered structure as well for the simplicity, the same items that you all mentioned, is the simplicity, but understanding that now there's a little more fairness now, particularly on the residential side in terms of how we're treating large house versus small house. I would have wanted to offer that up as well.
I would lean on that tiered residential, is where I'm headed. Question, someone here, but I know Doug and we've had this discussion with Doug as well, but you look at those kind of outliers or those one-offs in neighborhoods that pave their entire front yard, how do you go back and say, by doing that, you owe more, right? Because I do think you should, if you're gonna have the carrot, the stick has to be there too. And I think you're seeing that, somewhat in my neighborhood more, right? Where they're becoming multifamily, type things, and so they're putting literally the entire front yard into a pavement. They can do it with our rules today.
So it really drives you back to the square footage.
Kind of, but.
And I'm kind of between those two, to
But
be
can you
honest with
come back, right? Can you say tiered and if you do this? But then I don't know enforcement how you do that, right?
One of the things we've been thinking about too is, can we actually use our utility billing system to set up something quite that complex? And we don't know necessarily the answer to it, which has got staff thinking about what is simple, what can we actually implement as well. So we've got some answers that we still need to find on that point.
And I'm good with the tiered. I just wish we could come in, backyards too, right? You put the whole backyard into a pool and a concrete deck.
Is all the paved area included in the square footage?
Yes.
Yes, anything that's impervious.
So the tiering is based on, so we do the planometrics, we do the estimate. I believe that's how we did it. Because that's the database that you use to come up with these tiers is the impervious surface for the property.
So the square footage really is the purest form of what we're trying to do here. It actually doesn't look too bad on this chart. But if we want to get to behavior and incentive versus disincentive, it appears the square footage approach lends itself more to that, if that's really what you want to do.
I agree with you, I think it does too, but on the other hand, I think some of those, and I agree with Mike that, if you want to make your front yard into a parking lot, then, there should be an increased cost for that. I think that's probably the exception, not the norm. There's not a lot of those.
Correct.
No, that's true.
But I just still think that those, that individual should probably pay a higher rate than someone that is, has a rain garden and is being responsible,
Yeah.
One thing I would offer too for the council is, particularly when you think about like the base rate and square footage, so you have that kind of fixed and variable cost, you can have a philosophy in a utility too, where you're saying, okay, there's a base rate. It's what we do with the sewer utility, for example. You have a base connection cost for the base function of the utility. In our case, if you look at our community, it's really the green belt, right? That is our main stormwater asset in this community. So you could say, well, the base rate is focused on providing resources to maintain and enhance that main stormwater asset. Whereas in the square footage or variable cost then is now, because of the variability of the size of your house or the square footage that you have, that now is then paying for projects that have to provide that for that water runoff that's going to that main asset. And that's, so when you can really dig into it, you could go a lot of different ways with some of these philosophies of these rate structures.
That's helpful. We appreciate the direction on that. As you keep iterating on it, keep sending us your feedback. We're going to need to come back to this point so we have something very clear. But I think tonight, with the knowledge that we can create multiple financial models for you all to consider in the coming months, we can play around with including different rate structures in those models and see where we end up for your evaluation.
Great. Would you like me to go through these?
Yeah, well, I think we've, let me just take a quick look. Probably the last point there that we haven't come to would be, it's more just to keep adding to your thinking on this. It's the way we incentivize things using the stormwater utility isn't the only way that we can structure things. It could be a cost share program that we also use to incentivize certain behaviors. There could be a relationship with the water utility as well as we think about what the future of turf irrigation is. We know turf irrigation is in the headlines right now because of the drought. We know that it is a primary consideration for the city as we think about the future relationship with Des Moines Water Works. Is there an opportunity to align the storm sewer utility or the water resources utility with some of these others as well to ultimately get the kind of results that we'd like to see.
So to provide kind of just an example for the council to think about is if we're in a position where we have a regional water setup and there is a peaking rate that is determined, and City of Clive is a community that irrigates. We're a higher peaking community than a typical one. And if a rate structure for irrigation was put into place where it says, well, we're going to charge more for certain levels of irrigation, but we're going to utilize that revenue to plow into a cost-sharing program where we say to a resident, if you want to do SQR in your lawn, in terms of reestablishing your turf where you maybe don't have to irrigate it as much, again, plow it into water conservation programs on the backside, it might make for an interesting conversation about how those two utilities play off each other. Incentivize rain gardens, incentivize tree plant, certain kinds of tree planting that are maybe better for stormwater, tree trenches, things that folks can do in their yards that it isn't just, okay, we're just paying more for irrigation, it's being reinvested in the community and getting it more into the neighborhoods. And then if you really think about it, as we talked about with Harbach a few meetings ago, is we also could use a program like that to build compliance, a compliance bank for the city as we do street reconstructions like Harbach and neighborhoods, where we have our own stormwater compliance as a city if we're going to manage the runoff of those roads, where we could use that as building a bank in neighborhoods of, okay, we have 30 yards now that have done SQR. We note all that, and it is now a bank of, okay, we're going to reconstruct a street in that neighborhood as a part of our pavement management plan. We have a certain amount of square of runoff that we need to do just to comply with our own ordinance. Could we tap into that? So it almost could have a triple benefit. Again, that's just one example of how we could really play those off each other.
That one just confused me a bit, but we can get into it later. I don't, but you'd bank from.
The third layer is what got you.
You'd bank from my house, yeah, you bank from my house, right? And then the city would use the bank to reconstruct road.
So like for Harbach, when we reconstruct that road, our stormwater manual notes that when you're tearing out more than 5,000 square feet of impervious surface and replacing it, the city, even with our own roads, has a compliance to meet. So we have a certain amount of water quality volume runoff to manage as a city. We're doing that with Clark Street, with the bioswales that are going to be along Clark Street, and we're trying a pilot program with Harbach. So in a way, if we did cost-sharing programs for things like SQR or rain gardens on private property and do that at a scale of community-wide, you start to build up this bank of compliance that we have areas now that are more of a sponge than they were before. Why couldn't the city tap into that? If the city is providing money for the cost share, we're basically buying our compliance. So if instead of saying we're going to put, like with Harbach, you could do hard infrastructure to kind of manage that, where you're putting these underground chambers in that may cost a lot more money. Well, and also it's something the city has to maintain. If you say, well, we're going to, instead of spending that $300,000 on the hard infrastructure, you're going to spend that $250,000 on a cost share program for compliance in the community, and then the resident also gets a better yard and an amenity for themselves. It might be a way to really push the thought of water resources deeper into the neighborhoods. Yeah, that's a lot. I mean,
I got
down the line.
I got it.
And Mike, we want you to manage that program.
I am happy to do so.
And there's multiple
because
staff
it
on
will
this call
be-
that are probably like, Matt, don't go too far with that right now.
I get the wetland banks, right? I mean, Metro Waste has that and has done that. And so I get that. That's different than this. And so we're investing somewhere else. I say, why not both, right? Why is the city going to buy? So can I buy credits? And so I can
Maybe.
do whatever I want in my yard?
It has.
Hey, I'll
Yeah.
use Susan's bank because she's
those
going
are
to give them to me.
guardrails, yeah.
Susan will give me her points and I'm just going to willy-nilly do whatever I want in my yard and my neighbors. I just think that's a little slippery slope to say for the city to say, we're going to bank all your points and then we're just going to do whatever we want on our streets. How about both? How about you incentivize the neighbors and you do what's right by your rules as a city? I get it, it's expensive, but that's what we're laying out.
I think this is a work session
Yeah.
waiting to happen. I'm gonna pull us back, though, to the questions. Does the council want to change the existing structure of the utility? That's question number one. Are we on board with that?
I'm
kinda-
very interested
Yes.
in changing it to assist in putting some kind of incentive program together.
And that ties into number two,
It
I
does.
think.
But it's not just one. To me, it's that they go together.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, two and three, I think.
I'm open to changing and modifying and incentivizing all three of these courses.
Okay.
Excellent.
Does that give you some guidance?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Final topic is to talk through some of the regionally significant flood storage projects that we have modeled and evaluated. Stephanie Hoagie's going to talk through that.
So as Stephanie had mentioned earlier when we were going through the projects, we looked at a number of flood storage and flood risk reduction projects as part of this Water Resources Master Plan. So we have 7 different projects that are shown up here. We have 4 projects along W Avenue or Alice's Road. Then these 4 projects are detention basins, so holding water back during a flood event. We also looked at modifications at Country Club Lake, so this would be draining the pond, excavating out and turning it into a dry detention basin instead of the wet pond that it is now. We looked at adding a detention basin.
Let me hold back. So turning it into a dry basin.
So that means that it would just be grassed and there'd be no water there on a normal day. Then if it rains, then it would fill up, store water, and slowly release it.
And Steph, was part of that assessment, though, also the dam modification, because that was the specific recommendation in the Walnut Creek
Yes.
Master Plan?
Yep. So draining it and having it be dry would also
This is how
require
it's fine
those.
in that neighborhood.
Oh, I think it would be
Drain
a
that lake.
problem.
A lot of considerations with that one.
Yes.
Birds though in the butterfly flyway.
I think having a way that the dam is no longer passive, but active and could be operated differently would definitely be preferable. It's a huge amenity. You know, people who just moved in next door to me wanted so much to be on the lake. They had missed out on a few opportunities, went to my next door neighbor and basically said, we'll pay whatever it takes. And so for them to all of a sudden find out that
Yep.
went away, it would be
Yeah, it's a
a real
non-starter.
problem.
That's a non-starter.
Absolutely. And we did look at a scenario of if you kept the pond as a wet pond and only kind of changed some of the dam modifications, that didn't provide really any flood risk reduction downstream. So that's where we kind of went to this extreme of if you want to reduce flooding downstream at Indian Hills, we got to make this would be the big change that would require.
Yeah. This is sort of picking up a thread that came earlier this year when we were talking about the lake as an example of a private asset that might have some public benefit. We wanted to give it a fair assessment, even in the extremes. And so what you're seeing here is that attempt to be data-driven and fair assessment. Is it appealing? We're hearing very clearly it's not. But we don't present it because we think it's necessarily a great recommendation. It was more because we want to make sure we were being fair with the way we understood the asset, since it is such a big body of water right now, and common sense might suggest that, oh, yep, this is a place where there's some good that could be accomplished. In this scenario that we're presenting, the good that could be accomplished comes at an extremely high cost.
The more it keeps silting in, that might happen anyway. I don't know how much flood storage remains as that continues. The HOA does plan to dredge next year. So if there is an interest in doing something different, it's a good time to be talking to them.
I think when you see the rest of these slides, though, you'll see that if we're thinking about what are those opportunities that are more immediately in front of us, there are some others that present, that are more interesting from a timing standpoint, potentially.
Yeah, let's get to those, yeah.
All right, yeah, so Living History Farms, a detention basin on the farm. And then the last project is more of a local evaluation of recreating a remander of Walnut Creek just north of the Indian Hills neighborhood. So some of the details on each of these projects, Alice's Road and 240th Street Detention Basin. Right now, it's located in Dallas County. There are 2 property owners covering this area. We looked at, the way that we are able to achieve detention at all of these basins that we're going to be looking at is by raising the road, creating that embankment to hold water back. And so by raising the 240th Street here, we can get 240 acre feet. We'll estimate a construction cost of about $700,000, which gives us a total cost per acre feet of storage of about $2,900.
And if you left it alone, is there an example of what that blue would look like?
We don't have it shown here, but it wouldn't show a whole lot. There's the way that the culvert is constructed now is that it's not going to hold much back, so the blue would be very, very skinny.
For more developable land.
Yep.
That would be used, is it on a corner?
Yep.
So what about the cost of that land?
So we do include a land acquisition cost as part of this construction cost. It's just based on what the property value is now. So it's probable that that's going to be a lot more, but at this point, that's kind of what we assumed.
Plus loss of taxes and.
Yep.
It's complex. One other thing to keep in mind, though, is could it be an amenity for a future developer, for whatever jurisdiction is in charge of that development as well? That's definitely been an approach that Clive has taken when we're thinking about water resources and the Greenbelt. We see what that effect is on property values and on making something a desirable investment. So that's the other sort of side of that coin. Yes, loss in developable area. On the other side, though, potentially higher values because you've put these properties then next to an amenity. If it can be constructed as an amenity. One thing that we're really cognizant of is that a dry detention area that can hold a lot of water in a big storm event is not necessarily something real desirable to live next to. They're not pretty all the time. But a pond or a country club lake, that's a different thing. And so we're presenting tonight because we see that these are places where there could be that storage, but there are still other questions that would need to be answered to see whether these are economically feasible. The good news, our partners upstream in Grimes are looking very carefully at this space and imagining how they might be able to help solve this puzzle the same kind of way that Clive is approaching these types of things.
So next basin is just south of there. It's a little bit north of 250th Street along Alice's Road. This, again, is in Dallas County. It's a little bit smaller, so this area is a little bit more hilly, and so we aren't able to get that wide ponded area. So we're looking at 110 acre feet, estimated cost of about $500,000. So because we have that smaller area, we've got a higher cost per acre feet of storage at about $4,600 compared to 240th Street. Then basin just north of 260th Street along Alice's Road. Again, Dallas County, but City of Urbandale boundary is right on the east side of Alice's Road. So could potentially be City of Urbandale or coordinating with them being directly downstream. This is another bigger detention basin, 240 acre feet of storage. And there's only one property owner here. And so estimated construction costs, $420,000 and a lower cost per acre feet of about $1,700. And then the last one, we've talked a lot about Alice's Road and tonight, and so the last detention basin is in City of Clive, property owned by the City of Clive. We looked at a total storage of about 200 acre feet. Because it's owned by Clive, we can get a little bit cheaper cost, so $320,000. So a total cost per acre feet is about $1,600.
So in that scenario, would it have to be, we were talking about Alice's Road and what that would need to be under the road. So in that scenario, you would have to do it in a way where you have box culverts and an outlet structure that slowly allow, if we were to do something like that, you would have to do it in a way where it can't be a bridge, because a bridge would just let it pass through.
Correct.
So you're controlling the flow
Correct, yep.
and holding it back. So in this case, how much difference does that make downstream in terms of reducing a flood level?
You're going to have to be patient. We'll get to that in a minute.
Sorry.
Great question, great question. A couple more projects and then we'll get to those results there. So the Living History Farms, City of Urbandale, this one we can get a total of about 180 acre feet. This one has an estimated construction cost of about 1.5 million. Now, the reason why this is so much higher than all of the Alice's road basins is because this is a very narrow and steep valley. And so in order to get any storage, we're going to have a really high dam. And so there's going to be a lot of embankment and a lot of fill that needs to be brought in. It would actually be considered a high hazard dam, and so it would have to go through all of the Iowa DNR criteria. And because of that, that's where all of the higher expenses come in here.
How likely would Living History Farms be open to flooding 18 acres of their land?
180.
Well,
Oh, 18.
Yeah, 18 acres, 180 square acre feet.
Yeah.
okay, I'll give away an outcome here. When we did the cost-benefit analysis, did the ratio here, this one is just negative. It doesn't end up having a beneficial flooding effect, so we didn't want people to feel like we overlooked an area that has come up in past
Cost
conversations.
benefit ratio and the probability seem to be very low in the priority.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So then we kind of already talked about Country Club Lake, turning it in to a dry detention basin. We're able to really increase the flood storage. But, we've kind of already talked about this. And then lastly, the Indian Hills remeander. So this was originally identified in the Clive Streambelt Corridor Assessment. We wanted to evaluate it to see how it would impact, again, properties at Indian Hills. So it's a little more localized. It's taking the straightened channel and remeandering it to the previous alignment. So you can kind of see here, if we can get this. So this would be the existing channel, and then we'd create a new second channel, which was the old channel here. So that's kind of the different projects that we evaluated, and what we did is we looked at kind of combining them. So if we looked at all 4 Alice's Road detention basins, or all the projects together that we just talked about, these different scenarios, how does that kind of come together for benefit cost ratios? Steph, all right.
Great, thanks. So we took a look, you'll see the different headings here: Country Club Lake, Living History Farms, Alice's Road, and then we did a big group of all of those combined. So that 4th column there is Country Club Lake, Living History Farms, and the 4 detention basins on Alice's Road, Indian Hills. And then we also wanted to look at the 4 detention basins on Alice's Road with Indian Hills remeander. So this part of the process, we used the current scenario of what would flood and what would the damage costs be. And we also looked at, with these improvements, what is the reduction? And so we talk about those annual benefits there. That's really what we're diving into. What is the difference between what damage would have been occurred and what have we avoided with these improvements here? So the bolded row there of the benefit to cost ratio, that I think really helps us evaluate side by side which is providing the highest number. So as was mentioned, Living History Farms has a negative BCR and therefore was not evaluated further. We didn't approximate or evaluate what the reduction at the flood stage would be. The highest performance was the Alice's Road, which is all 4 basins, is the way that we evaluated that together. I do want to make that note so you are aware that it's the 4 of them grouped together.
And one of those is on Clive City property, correct?
Correct. Yes. So you can see the highest number there is Alice's Road. the full group in the biggest price tag there of the combined scenario has a pretty high ratio there of 8.4, as well as Alice's Road plus the Indian Hills Remeander has that same 8.4. Country Club Lake, which we should note is not going to be considered farther, it also in our prioritization system that we talked about previously, it did not perform very well based on the feedback you provided of what should be prioritized. So even with that of quantifying what that flood reduction would be, it still didn't perform very well based on its public use as well as being on private property, and it didn't serve the rest of the benefits you wanted to evaluate. So I do want to point out what some of those reductions were. The greatest observed was greater than a foot. And I do want to switch over to Google Earth to talk through this just to orient a little bit what we're talking about. So when we talk about
So can I ask one point real quick too?
Sure.
As you're thinking about the benefit, because we're going to look at the entire watershed here, those calculations are just benefits based on values of properties and property or damages avoided for Clive properties.
Yes.
We know that the projects that we're talking about potentially have benefits that extend into other communities as well. And if they are potential partners in this with us and our value, then we're looking at benefit numbers that are even higher than what we've seen in that chart. And as we look at this, you will see just from the color coding just with a quick glance, some areas that really stand out where there are significant changes in surface water elevations during this 50-year style event. The other thing to note, when we look at this, we have not seen the 50-year event in our recorded history for Walnut Creek. The events that we've seen in 15 and 18 or more, as I talked to Doug about it, maybe in that 30, 40-year type event. This event that we're going to look at is definitely something we need to be prepared for. These types of things are in our future. The evidence here that we're going to present, the modeling that we'll present, shows, though, that there is an opportunity for building up some significant resilience in some of these most flood-prone areas.
Thanks, Pete. And to talk a little bit more about the process. So in our modeling, we have a boundary of where flooding occurs, as well as how deep all of that flooding is in each of those areas. With that information, we used the city's, their GIS database of the properties that are within that flooding inundation area and used that to create and generate a lot of these numbers. We do have this analysis, as Pete mentioned, is just for the city of Clive, but as we switch over to this map, you'll see it really does extend in effect in a regionally significant way. So, Steph, do you want to talk through some of these here?
All right, so two things that we kind of want to focus on in these maps, and Steph kind of alluded to this, is that first, looking at the total ponded area. So what it would look like now if a 50-year event happened versus what the ponded area would look like with, this is an example, with the 4 Alice's Road detention basins. So as we're kind of panning through this area, the way to identify that is these pink areas show the ponding in existing conditions today. And then when we see, so where we see the ponding versus when we don't with the other color coding, that's showing that we have a reduction in ponded area. And so not as many houses or not as many properties are getting flooded. And then the second thing to look at is what is the actual flood reduction depth. And so that's what this color coding here shows, is that as we pan through here with these 4 different detention basins, we can show a reduction in ponding, the ponded depth of over 2 feet in some places. So we'll see, further up, kind of outside of the city of Clive limits, we see benefits there. Coming into Clive, we're looking at 1.5 or 1 to 2 feet of flood reduction. When we look at, so the numbers in that table at Indian Hills Woods, that's at this point here. So we're between 0.5 foot to 2 foot flood reduction. But really, as we kind of have been talking about, it extends beyond City of Clive. So Windsor Heights, we see a really significant reduction down there. And so that's where these projects not only will benefit City of Clive, but the entire watershed. Any questions about this map here and what we're showing?
And this is the 4.
Yep. Yep.
Is this the current modeling or no consideration of build-out of?
Correct. This would be existing conditions as the city is and as the watershed is today.
Do we get into that to model if we spend 5 million in 10 years, it's nothing, right? I mean, this goes back to today's modeling.
Sure. I want to go to Doug on that one because we are in the phase 2 of the Silver Jackets program where we are looking at a complete build out of the watershed and assumptions about how much impervious is coming with that. That's the type of data we could bring to this analysis to understand what the effects could be as well. The assumption, though, is that as we further urbanize the watershed, we are talking about huge amounts of water that come at us fast if we just use existing practices, and so the risk is going to potentially increase.
But as who continues to urbanize the watershed? Who's the we in this scenario, right? Because Clive is very finite on what we have left to urbanize. And what is, again, sorry I have to think this way, but what is the ROI on that last space? I get it, we need to do something, but the ROI of a last 20 acres or 10 acres of build out for Clive, does it warrant $5, $10, $15 million plus giving property back of Clive's, plus the tax base, plus to affect downstream?
Yeah.
So those partnerships will be important, but if it doesn't change the needle for Clive.
Now, from where we are with current planning for our area, the park area for this project, I don't know how much over and above what we're showing in these maps would chew into where we would otherwise have put park area. I don't believe it, though, cuts into areas that we'd previously identified for private development that would be future property tax base as well. So I don't, if I'm following your logic there correctly, Councilman, I don't see there being a sort of an opportunity loss, an opportunity cost for the city on that particular parcel. When it comes to those others that are in Dallas County, though, yes, there's a important consideration that they would need to make about what don't they get because they have decided to dedicate a portion of that land, if they can control it, to this type of a watershed approach or watershed solution.
Well, I think, and we can do this in a workshop as well, Mayor, but I think the bigger thought is that, yes, losing some of our own property is a consideration, but when you only have so much build out left in Clive and you do these fairly major modifications to the watershed, how does it change the folks for Clive, their map, and how does it reduce flooding of our properties versus let it build out and try to partner with North and South and us do some stuff too. But I'm worried that regardless of what we do, Urbandale will build and Grimes will build and farther up and Waukee will build. And this will all be for naught in 10 years or 15 or 20 years. And we just spent millions and millions of dollars. For us, not really, right?
It's knowing that your fate is tied to so many other players who can choose to behave in ways that are not paying attention, I guess, to the Clive interest. Yeah, that is definitely a part of this game. That's the nature of working on a regional scale within the watershed. So your point is well made.
Can you back this map out just a little bit?
Yep.
So really what we're talking about is a lot of investment for anywhere from 0.49 to, maybe 2 feet of flood level reduction, really on the east end of Clive.
Indian Hills Woods and then also the southeast corner, yep.
And Indian Hills can somewhat be dealt with. I think we need to tackle the West Des Moines piece as well, right?
Absolutely.
In that,
These models don't assume like surface, the sheeting and that kind of flash flooding event like we saw in 2018 where it came rushing down the hill. These are just talking about the flows that would be in Walnut Creek. Is that correct, Steph?
That's correct, yep.
And so how many floods do we really have that aren't that sheeting in Indian Hills? I mean, usually those are flash flood deals. And if this doesn't address that, now I even question even further the logic behind doing these, right?
This is why we do the prioritization of the values.
No, I get
right?
it,
So
I
that we
get
can
it. And that's why
weigh
we do
these
this
things.
exercise,
Yep.
yeah.
Just focusing on the one where the city already owns the land, would that be a sufficient size body of water to offer some real recreation opportunities?
Looking at that too.
We did not look at it individually, so I do not know what that benefit would be.
And that was a dry
But
basin,
it's
and that was
dry.
a dry
That's
basin.
the Alice's Road.
Dry basin.
That's a dry basin.
I know it's a conglomeration, I don't think the property costs are realistic. I think they're likely to be much higher because it's in the path of development. I don't think we can go out and buy it for the cost of farmland.
Yep.
But what we do own might be something worthwhile regardless. So I'd be interested in knowing how it might be used for recreation. And then really looking at what the likely costs would be to do the others. I just think we should be realistic.
One thing I would add to that too, Councilmember Jenkins, is when I think about those upstream ones, particularly in Urbandale and potentially Grimes, if they annex that area, is if they are going to be developed areas, they're going to have to do some kind of stormwater management, just out of normal kind of stormwater ordinance, maybe not as advanced as ours, but just normal compliance. And so back to Councilmember McCoy's comment of the partnerships is, when we think about those upstream efforts, if there's going to need to be stormwater management in these developments, can it be done in a way where maybe it is a pond that would add an amenity to the development? They're going to need to do something anyway. Is there something where then the city of Clive comes alongside that other city and says, well, you need to do some stormwater management, but we're interested in you doing it a certain way that adds acre feet of storage downstream? Because a lot of these things that we're looking at on this map is timing, right? So you need to do things far enough upstream, because if you have the heavy rain event across the whole watershed, some of it's going to go through, right? North Walnut Creek, for example, is the flashiest of flashiest floods that we've ever had in 2018. But that gets through, like for example, that night of that storm, we didn't really have a flood on Walnut Creek. It was a minor one, but we had a major one on North Walnut Creek. And a lot of that had to do with timing. The water all came at once. North Walnut Creek flooded, went out, and then Walnut Creek raised up slowly after it. And so some of it's timing of right, in terms of the meander being further downstream, the basins being up higher. And so I think about those partnerships of, the Grimes and Urbandale, they have land use plans for these areas. I know they do. And is it where we come alongside them to say, okay, if you're going to put some kind of amenity in here, can we get 2 more feet of storage or and I don't know what that number is, but using this as a guidepost for us to start those conversations. And then Windsor Heights, who we know is having conversations on their own flood resiliency down in the Colby Park neighborhood of, boy, if this might be a lot cheaper number than putting big flood walls in down there to protect their own properties. And so can we start through the WMA, which this is exactly the reason that vehicle was set up, as you know, Susan, very well, is how can we then start to move the needle on some of these regional projects where then it does make sense for a city of Clive or a city of Windsor Heights to say, we're going to put $500,000 in your stormwater structures in your developments, but then you're required to maintain it and you're required to provide this kind of storage, because we need to get that return on investment for the long term for those dollars.
Good point.
The other part of this is we're building Alice's Road. We've just had a discussion about how important that corridor is going to be to defining how people move throughout all of the cities as we continue to grow. If we have an opportunity here to take on one infrastructure project, pair it with another beneficial infrastructure project, that's delivering greater value.
To me, that's a natural one. It's our property, we own it already, we need to find a way to regulate that water in an emergency situation to where we can back it up. It's not gonna be a lake all the time, but it's floodway.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And then, you get with Grimes and you get to that north end of, of the watershed where it's a lot easier you're dealing with a narrower creek up there. This is complex, there's a lot to it. I think there seems to be general consensus that this is good thinking, that we need to get our minds wrapped around all of this. I don't know how much guidance you need tonight, but Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would agree, Mayor. I think that, the key one right there is the property we already own. If we want to look at starting one of these projects right there, but I couldn't agree more. The real answer is regionalization, looking outside the borders of Clive to where the situation occurs and working with our neighbors and showing them how it benefits them as well, and having that mutual understanding and finding that common ground that there's return on investment for Clive, there's return on investment for whether it's Windsor Heights, Grimes, Urbandale, wherever it is, but that's really the key right there. And, looking at the questions, I am in favor of making those investments as long as it's smart and strategic and we've got the ROI on it for Clive to make these investments now, look at the long term. But Mike, I also agree with you that, look, if we don't, part of that regionalization is looking at their building, and if we're making plans right now and all of a sudden, boom, they put a bunch of shopping malls in with huge parking lots that increase that runoff and the fast water, et cetera, then it's all for naught. So it's really a wide, complex picture right there with a lot of conversations, but that's my thoughts.
Steph, do you have more
I
on your slides?
do not, unless there's more questions.
We're kind of at the end of the, okay.
Sure. Well, why don't we go ahead and skip to that last slide then, Steph? We've covered most of these questions here for the council about these projects that are regionally significant and outside. We'll continue to evaluate and sharpen our pencil on the total benefit, and also start to test the feelings of our neighbors as
So
well.
you're clear on what we find appealing and not appealing? I just want to make sure.
We want to make sure, first and foremost, that we have defined a clear benefit for Clive. And if that exists, and it involves then potentially investing in other parts of the watershed, if we have willing partners, then we can further pursue those conversations with those folks. But tonight, what I'm taking from council, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is the boundaries of the city matter, but more important than that is the benefit defined for our Clive neighborhoods and our businesses, protecting those properties. And if that means stretching outside our boundaries and finding ways to work regionally in the few places where we still can, we should take a crack at it.
That's fair.
Well, and I think broader analysis as well is that, hey, based on what we know of potentially viable projects and what those costs would be, is a foot to 2 feet of reduction worth it? I think we really got to ask ourselves that question. I don't know if we're quite ready to answer that question yet. I think we need to look at this some more.
I appreciate that.
To me, that's the bottom line.
Appreciate that. And that kind of brings us full circle to where we started tonight. So we have a greater appreciation now for what the definition of flood mitigation looks like in this scenario. How does that change the way you think about comparing the different values in these different projects? Thank you. Very generous with all of your time tonight. I appreciate it very much. Appreciate our HDR team helping out as well. They did a great job putting together a whole lot of analysis and weaving together a lot of strands from a lot of studies we've done over time. Here's where we're heading. Draft topics for the July presentation will be a vision document. We'll take our best shot, given your feedback, on sort of wrapping these things together, defining the outcomes that we think the council is saying are most important. And then also talking about future O&M needs, opportunities, divisions of responsibility, and a community incentive/engagement program opportunity as well. Once we get to August, that's where we're going to dig in deep with these much more complex financial models. We've already seen, and that HDR team has already built that shell. Now we have to go plug in the projects, plug in the O&M costs that we foresee, plug in the rate, and then start to have that conversation about how fast do we want to go after these things to make these improvements? How does it fit within the larger CIP? How does it walk up the rate? We already know we're sort of on that path with the stormwater utility. Do we want to stay at about that rate or that pace, or do we want to accelerate, or do we want to slow it down? you'll have the modeling to start to have those kinds of discussions with actual dollars and data in front of you. We'll also have a whole host of other policy questions for you because if it wasn't, anytime we're dealing with water resources, we're talking about a lot of intertwined things. And I really appreciate the work HDR has done to help keep those intertwined things clear, at least in my mind. They've been very helpful in that respect, and I think once we get to August, you all will have a similar experience. But it won't be easy. These are going to be some tough questions that we're tackling.
Pete, thank you. HDR team, thank you. Look forward to our continued work. There's a lot to do, but it's all good. We can all agree. Any questions as we wrap this item up? Okay, seeing none, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. We'll move to reports then. I guess, Pete, we're going to go right back to you.
I've already said a lot tonight, Your Honor. I have nothing more to share.
You're good. Okay, you're full. Eric.
Yeah, a couple of things. District 1 Citizens Advisory Committee met. We're moving forward as far as through the process and in what the information we've gathered from District 1, from the folks out, the stakeholders out there. So moving forward with that process right there. Catch Des Moines Board of Directors also met. The Ironman was last week. It was a nice success. Also, the National Junior High School Rodeo came off as well. So we're starting to see these large projects come, bringing people, putting heads in beds, and starting to see a reemergence of tourism back in Des Moines. Overall financials, I'll sell those out, but they're on the upswing right there. So again, things looking positive. They're starting to get staff back on board, ramping up right there. So a good outlook for Des Moines for the visitors and tourism. Of course, the principal financial golf tournament went very well as well. So a lot of good things happening and leading up to the Iowa State Fair coming up here in August. So some good stuff.
It's right around the corner.
It is.
Thanks, Eric. John.
Nothing for me.
Susan.
Well, speaking of watershed management authorities, the North Raccoon Watershed Coalition meets tomorrow, and it's going to be interesting to see how that continues to function or not. There's been tension between some of the northern and southern parts of, unfortunately, and we no longer have a director. So it'll be very interesting to see the future direction, I think. So stay tuned.
That's kind of sad to hear that.
I hate to be pessimistic.
Yeah, we need to make progress there.
Right, we really do.
Thank you, Susan. Mike?
I have nothing tonight.
Madam Council?
Nothing tonight, thank you.
Matt?
Thank you, Your Honor. One thing that I wanted to, just as we get to between now and the next council meeting will be the 4th of July. And so our favorite topic this time of year is fireworks. And so wanted to just kind of provide a little bit of a refresher. I know there's been some questions in terms of some of the fireworks sale locations in the community, and just kind of circle back a little bit to that conversation we had a few years ago, and a refresher on the parcels or the zoning classifications in Clive where Class 1 and Class 2 fireworks can be sold. And so I will include this this map in my email to you tomorrow as well, or tonight. But this shows kind of the yellow shaded areas of those that were Class 2, so kind of more of the retail fireworks, sparklers, kind of level fireworks are allowed to be sold. Pretty much all our commercial areas or retail areas. And then in those that green hashed area is really those Class 1, so the ones that can go in the air and go boom. And so we have 2 locations in Clive this year that's anticipated for fireworks Class 1 sales. The usual spot in front of Competitive Edge that's been there for the last couple of years, and a new one this year. And you'll notice there is one parcel way out here that is an M1 zoning classification in front of overhead door. And that
actually closer
is,
to Klein's house.
I've already checked it out.
They checked the zoning maps, and that is the one parcel out there that could have Class 1 fireworks sales. So that is the same person who's operating the Competitive Edge site is operating a second site out there. So again, just I know there was some questions of that particular site. Again, it's an old county. It was old county property that was annexed into the city. That does have the M1 zoning classification, so the light industrial zoning
They
classification.
pull up out there with a container and open a container.
Welcome to my hood.
you know?
That's
right?
what we got. Competitive edge,
Have
couple
standards.
containers.
I don't know if you've seen the new brick and mortar structure in Windsor Heights at Sherwood Forest.
I have not seen
It's a
that one.
really nice building. It's a permanent structure, obviously, it's fireworks. It's a fireworks. Yeah.
Is the whole thing fireworks? Scott, I saw him
I didn't go into it. I've just seen it from the outside, but I'm assuming that it
in
is.
Sherwood Forest, right?
Yeah,
You're right on the corner.
where the standard station used to be. Yeah.
Most important part as well is
At least
we're
that's
also,
somewhat attractive.
We're also reaching out to the community and continuing to educate our residents in terms of that it is illegal to utilize Class 1 fireworks within the city of Clive's borders. Particularly in a time, of course, we've had some rain this week, but in a time of drought as well, it's also a good idea. I know our law enforcement folks will do the best they can in terms of those calls, and yep. As Lieutenant Rayberg smiles over there. But as you know, for our folks, it's a challenge, right, in terms of having it happen and seeing it happen. I know some of our residents can get frustrated by that, but our folks do the best they can with the tough circumstances to do enforcement of fireworks. So it will definitely be the majority thing on the call sheet that night, I'm sure, on July 3rd and July 4th. But we're utilizing social media and all of our communication avenues to and remind folks. I know the mayor's letter for this upcoming newsletter will have something in it about it, is in terms of that. Again, the Class 1 sales, Class 2 sales are allowed. Utilization of Class 1 is not allowed in the city of Clive. So just wanted to provide that update. Any questions or comments? Again, I'll provide this map in my email to you as well if you wanted to look at it for reference.
Matt, would it be possible for you to also include our neighbors, what they're doing as far as what's permitted and?
I believe that all of our neighbors, it's illegal now, except for Waukee. Waukee is the only one that I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
is
Then
still
they're
allowed.
limited days, aren't they? I think.
That
to
I
remember.
do not recall off the top of my head.
I believe that's the case. I know that we did get outreach from the Register this week asking, they're doing a metro-wide piece on all the different regulations across the cities.
So the Klein finale at the graduation party wasn't really up to,
One other thing that I'd also like to get on the calendar, and I know Councilmember Weaver isn't here, but I'm going to follow up with him as well, is the next kind of round of taking the full council out to the public safety facility. So a lot of changes happening since you toured it last in late April, I believe that was. And we'd love to get you out there again, probably looking kind of late July, early August, kind of before strategic planning, because by the time we get to that point, we should have all the paving done, and we'll have pretty much most, if not all, the rooms drywalled, so you'll really get a feel for what the building's going to look like. So just throwing out there, we have 5 Thursdays in July, so looking at that last one, July 29th, or getting into early that next week, like such as August 2nd. Really interested in kind of what makes sense. I know get into the summer, calendars get very tough, especially now with vacations and whatnot. So really throwing just a couple dates out there if you've got other suggestions or conflicts, but would really love to get the full council out there again as soon as we can.
I think the 29th of July then.
Yeah, that'd be the
Actually,
last
it's good.
Thursday of July.
What time are you thinking?
Kind of similar time frames, kind of good to do it 5:30 after the work crews have kind of moved out of there.
Much
Although
from
last
that-
time we ended up still having one guy that was still there because he had some catch up to do, but it's a little easier to walk around when they're not all working in there. So
How do we firm that up on an email or?
yeah, I'll follow up with it.
That,
Throw out some proposed
okay,
dates.
so far with that?
Superintendent Edwards will get those workers out of there.
And I know, circle back on this, and I know I've talked with a few of you about it, but in terms of thinking of September and the DC trip, in terms of the desires of the council to attend that, it is during, it's September 22nd through the 24th. Our council, we do have a council meeting that falls in the middle of that, although we do have 5 Thursdays in September as well. So if there is a majority of the council and we have, we're not able to necessarily have a quorum for that meeting, we could also do some adjusting and move that meeting to the last Thursday in September as well. But again, I know there's been some interest, so I wanted to kind of get a feel from the council who's interested so we could start planning. I know Pete's going to head that up as he's done the last couple of times that we've went.
You'll be out. I will more than likely be out. John will be here. Eric will go. Ted will probably go.
Okay.
It'll be most of us.
So it looks like you will likely have a quorum that'll be going.
4 or 5, yeah.
So we will,
Being out there. God, I'm just kidding.
You'd let
would be a
Edward-
little bit of a, well, we could do a virtual, you could do a Zoom meeting.
We could.
But, no, we'll plan on that, and then I'll follow up with Ted as well. And, if that is the case, would it be the preference of the council for us to adjust that meeting and just basically move that back a week?
Seems to make sense, but
Because you're definitely going to still need to have a business meeting that second half of September just for bill paying and things like that. So as a staff, we'll plan for that, and then Pete will start following up on specific registration and, again, with some of the changes in terms of looking at community-based projects, federal infrastructure bills coming. The interactions with our federal delegation is going to be more important than maybe it has been in past years because of those opportunities. And as we've talked around this, in this council chambers about a variety of projects, whether it be Greenbelt Landing, future reuses of Diamond Public Safety in District 1, other projects, that there might be opportunities for federal dollars to filter into those projects. Hickman Road, interchange. I think the contact with our federal delegation is going to get more important in years to come. Last thing I have is I'll be on vacation in early July, so I will not be here for the first meeting in July. But, that's all I have, Your Honor, unless folks have any questions.
Matt, we had
I'm not calling in from Croatia.
you and I participated last Thursday on a Zoom meeting with Des Moines Waterworks and the micro group. I'd like to share your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's
And I'll add to it.
It's been a very incremental process over a series of years. I continue to be optimistic about the movement that has been made, and the micro group is really made up of the 3 utility boards, so West Des Moines Water Utility Board, Urbandale, and Des Moines Waterworks. And they've been meeting on a couple, about every 2 or 3 weeks for the last year, basically, to work through a number of the issues. And I would say that I am surprised that how many items that they have gotten through. There are still some items, some key items on how benefit versus growth in terms of how that's calculated. So long and short of it is, if we have a new treatment plan or new infrastructure asset that needs to be added, is it the growing community? How much do the growing communities pay for that versus, the non-growing that still benefit from the redundancy? So is it the growing communities paying 100% of it, or is it 90-10? What's that percentage? So those are some things that they're still working through. There's been a recognition, which I think is a really good one, of not determining what that peaking rate needs to be. Originally, Des Moines Waterworks offered a 2.5 times peaking. So if you peak above that of your normal usage, then there'd be a surcharge. Des Moines Waterworks, to their credit, relented on that to say, we think there should be one in place, but we're willing to let a new regional board decide that and what that needs to be. And that's a huge conversation for Clive, because we teeter around that peaking rate. In some years, we've gotten close to 3. So that's an important conversation for us. So I think there's still some things left on the table, but I don't know, Your Honor, what your thoughts are, but I think we're getting, there are items that can be negotiated and determined. Population versus water consumption on the board, the weighted board makeup. I think we're getting into levels of details at that point where there can be agreement, where we were far away from that a year ago.
I think we're really close. To your point, asset transfer, a lot of these complicated things, they're getting very close on.
Which we're part of that, right? When it comes to our capacity we've purchased, I mean,
Correct.
we're a bigger player than knowing that we have that capacity as a tool, right?
Right.
Yeah, that asset transfer, our existing purchase capacity, and we have excess, is a part of that asset transfer, and how that's valued is definitely something that's been very important to us. And it's almost, basically, they're kind of turning it into almost like a lease payment situation, where they're basically leasing our asset from us and paying us for it over time in terms of a rate reduction. And so at some point that falls off, and then we're treated like any other community. And so to me, that seems reasonable, because it recognizes the investments that we made. but also not putting it where you have to pay for it all at once, because that's going to make that asset transfer a lot more complicated. So again, I think it's still going to benefit Clive, a community like Clive, to be a part of that, especially now that they've made the decision that any entity, a party to this agreement, initially will have a seat. So it isn't a population,
gotta
like you
pass
have to
that
be
one.
above a certain population threshold. Clive would have a seat if we were at the table, or if we were a part of the entity, which I think was a big one that the mayor and I pushed on.
Beginning.
It's better to have more entities at the table. You don't necessarily have to have a bunch of members, but at least one member that it's going to help with those regional conversations.
Well, it's not reinventing it, right? I mean, DART, Metro Waste
Yeah.
Authority,
That's what they look to.
there's your model.
Yeah, the model's
I mean,
there.
DART followed Metros and
Right.
let water follow
Yeah.
a like thing. It
And
does
it's
make me a
following
little,
WRA in a lot of ways.
The
They're looking
WRA
at-
is another one, right?
Yeah.
That fall into that.
They're looking a lot to that model which makes sense. It's another utility,
Yeah.
regional utility.
makes me a little nervous on gallons versus population. It's, on the surface, it sounds like let your spigots run and you get more votes, but,
Well, and that's where Des Moines Waterworks would say population, and suburban communities might say water usage
Right.
because we irrigate more.
right,
So that's
yeah.
that's the debate.
Well, so hopeful.
Yeah, it's coming
here.
along.
And it'll be better for the Metro, here, Des Moines Metro.
At
we
least we're
get
having
there.
a debate.
Yeah, well, and it's not just debate, this is, I mean, I think we're getting down to net cutting here, which is great for all of us, so, Matt,
And
thanks.
speaking of water, obviously with the rains this week, in a lot better shape. Regionally went from, and I'll have the details of this in my email to you, mid-80s in terms of million gallons per day at the peak, and now we're down to the low 60s, around 60 because of the rains. So Des Moines Waterworks still has their stage 1 water conservation in place, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to be probably the majority of the summer.
Yeah.
With us being in June, talking about water conservation. So, but good to see the timely rains that we're getting, and I can just tell you from Clive's pumpage, we hit our peak, historical peak ever, of 4.19 million gallons last week Wednesday, and we were down to 2.7 yesterday. So that just gives you a sense of how much irrigation we have in Clive during dry weather.
With the rains, Klein, you can call Weaver and tell him he can shower now.
We'll do it. We'll do it.
Other questions for Matt, council? Matthew, any other correspondence?
Nothing further.
Council, anything else for the good of the order? Seeing none, I'm going to adjourn us at 8:06. Thanks, everybody.